Hello and welcome to ALECtv, the American Legislative Exchange Council's video channel. I'm your host, Matt Fisher, and joining me today is Weifeng Zhong, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center of George Mason University, and a frequent presenter on ALEC's Across the State podcast series, as well as at meetings of the Federalism and International Relations Task Force. And we also have Karla Jones, Senior Director of ALEC's Federalism and International Relations Task Force, joining us today. Karla, Weifeng, welcome to our program. It's great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure and honor.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful to have you, Dr. Zhong.
Thank you.
Well, it's clear that the U.S. and China are competing both in the economic and the strategic space. Could you describe what that competition is, and also, just as importantly, what are some of the signs that we're either winning or losing that competition?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's one of the most important foreign policy questions facing the U.S. for the next at least many decades, if not a century. And I think we are at the critical juncture in the history because after about 20 years of what I would call romantic engagement between U.S. and China, now we are seeing a lot of problems because we sort of were overlooking the security concerns coming from dealing with China in this sort of a romantic way. Now, in the past about 4 years or so, I think the U.S. also has tried the other extreme, which is leaning toward decoupling. And that didn't work quite well because we saw all these tariffs on Chinese imports from China, but it's not changing any Chinese behavior in any meaningful way. So now I guess we are in between. We got into this romantic engagement 20 years ago. Now it's too costly to divorce. And so now, where do you find the sort of the optimal point in between the two extremes? I think that's the most critical challenge. And from what we have seen so far, I think the U.S. has not. It doesn't seem like the U.S. government has come up with a solution about where we are at. And if they have any ideas, they have not been open to the American people yet. Like where our policymakers are leading the country to, and what are the costs that American consumers and businesses will be paying in the future. So I think that's something, a very important message that policymakers should be delivering to the American people, and we haven't seen it yet.
You know, something that, being a young person, technology is all the rage for us, and is Beijing's latest crackdown on Chinese big tech companies a revival of Maoism in the old sense? Are we seeing a revival of Maoism, or does it represent some form of China decoupling from the U.S. and global economies?
Yeah, that's a very timely question. There's a lot of talks about that, alluding to what Mao would say the common prosperity. So basically taking money and wealth from rich people and redistribute it to the poor.
Right.
And of course, the Chinese government would take a cut in the middle. But what I see, actually, I think that's a very common conception now. But what I see actually is that I think it's more likely to be some sort of a tool to get some sort of distancing between U.S. and China. Because if you look at all these big tech crackdowns, there's an underlying motivation on the Chinese government side to get the companies which are listed overseas, including the U.S. stock exchanges, to go back to the Chinese economy. And so that's, I see that more for serving the purpose of getting some sort of decoupling between U.S. and China than to really say we are going to redo all the economic reforms. I think that's highly unlikely at this point. But that's also important to understand it, because if China is already going for some form of decoupling, then the fact that we're not seeing any clear-cut response from the U.S. is concerning, because China has its game plan together.
Right.
We on this side still seem to be thinking about it, right? So we have all this trade policy under the Biden administration that's currently being reviewed, right? 8 months into the new presidency, it's still being reviewed. So I don't see the big picture. Like I said, it's important to have a big picture in front of the American people. I don't think the current administration is doing that. Whereas what we see in China is that they are already doing something.
Right. Right. They're ahead of the ball there, game there.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
No, that's what I was going to say. So I think it's important to really get there as soon as possible to lay out a plan about the U.S.-China strategy for the next decades to come.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And while we're on the subject of tech, would you mind describing China's artificial intelligence ecosystem, Microsoft and Google and other US companies' involvement, and Beijing's establishment of artificial intelligence research centers?
Yeah, that's another place where the US and China are very different in terms of how they approach big data and artificial intelligence. So if you think about, so what we have seen in, for example, in the US pullout from Afghanistan, is that the US government sort of underestimated how quickly the Taliban would take over, right? And part of that was actually that the US intelligence has, for decades, been focusing on stealing secrets and keeping secrets. So that's the way the US intelligence operates. And for a while it worked because when we didn't have the internet, right? So when the more secrets you steal, the more information you have, hence the more knowledge you have. But now we're at a different time because we can generate knowledge from publicly available information. We don't need to steal secrets as much anymore. That's precisely the strategy of China's AI. Because China has been under a state sponsorship, the Chinese government has been working with a lot of private enterprises, companies, state-owned enterprises as well, but also private companies to gather a lot of open source information, including on the Americans. And they are generating a lot of knowledge that serves the Chinese government's policymaking purposes. That this kind of public-private partnership is what we don't see in the US. And we have private companies in the US who try to get into the market in China, right? And so sometimes they would make some sort of sacrifices in terms of what we consider the values that we cherish in order to get into the Chinese market. So we are not only that we are not doing the public-private partnership that I think the US should do, we are also sacrificing our values in terms of getting into the Chinese market. So that adds to another layer of concerns.
Okay. And in addition to the lack of public-private partnerships, what other factors give China such dominance in the AI space?
So we can look at this at two dimensions. One is whether they have really good technologies that we do not have, and the other is whether they have a lot of data that we don't have. I think the second scenario is more plausible for in the case of China or US-China competition, because China is not really making a lot of groundbreaking advances in artificial intelligence. The tools that we have seen so far are pretty standard compared to what the US researchers have found out. But the difference is that given the same or similar tools, for AI it's important that if you have when you have a lot of data, you learn a lot more from another scenario where you only have a limited amount of data.
Right.
So the data advantage is what China has in the AI space. Another asymmetry, what I see is that if you look at the number of Chinese AI researchers, a lot more of them are able to read English publications in the US. But if you ask a random AI researchers in the US, are you able to read Chinese publications about AI? Highly likely they would say no, right? So that's also very important because in this day and age, if you have fast access to information or knowledge generated by other people, it helps your innovation too. So if you are not watching what the Chinese researchers are doing, then you will be easily falling behind.
Definitely. So recently a report surfaced about China's public pension system investing more than $3 billion in Chinese companies, including 14 state-owned enterprises blacklisted by the previous administration, the Trump administration, because of their ties to the Chinese military. So with that in mind, for our viewers right today, how alarmed should we be by these findings that 14 state-owned companies linked to the Chinese military that were blacklisted by the Trump administration? How alarmed should we be by these findings, and how pervasive is such investments in U.S. entities?
So that's a question. It's very hard to answer that question. And the reason for that is because for, I think, almost a decade now, since most specific, especially after President Xi took office, the line between state sector and private sector in China is increasingly blurred. So that's where we sort of have seen the departure in terms of the Chinese economic model from what we saw under Deng Xiaoping, the economic opening, the economic reform and opening up. And the blurring the line matters because now we can no longer confidently say that if you see a privately owned company then it's not serving any Chinese state purposes. But if you see a state-owned enterprises, it's working for the Chinese government. Now you can no longer say that, because even private companies, they can work for state policy-making purposes. And the same also goes for state-owned enterprises. Not all state-owned enterprises are doing this kind of aggressive, having this kind of aggressive behavior that would jeopardize U.S. National security.
Right.
So it's hard. It's really hard to draw the line. I think it is a not very bad line to say that state-owned enterprises are more concerning. But I think there are a lot of private enterprises that are also very concerning. And we can just tell by our usual paradigm that if you're privately owned, then you're fine.
Yeah, definitely, that makes sense.
And the situation in Afghanistan is top of mind for many of our members. As you know, at the most recent task force meeting where you presented, we had former Afghan Ambassador Roya Rahmani speak. We had the model policy adopted. Week before last, we did a policy hour on Afghanistan. How concerned should we be about deepening ties between China and Afghanistan and China's access to Afghanistan's mineral wealth?
Yeah, so on that, I'm not too concerned, I have to say, for the following reason. So we see the potential upside for China to getting into the Afghanistan natural resources. But the downside is also very significant in the sense that it's hard to mine those mineral resources without good infrastructure or just the basic order of the society, right? Which Afghanistan actually lacks.
At this point, it's not very ordered right now.
Yeah.
And it's worse than when the U.S. was there, right?
Right.
And so now for Chinese companies to actually capture the natural resources, they will have to provide what the U.S. was providing, and perhaps more, right? Because we know that China has about 2 major investment projects in Afghanistan for the last about 15 years or so. Neither of them made any profits. Precisely for the reason that even when U.S. was there, it still lacks the basic economic or social infrastructure to make that happen. So I'm not too concerned for that's one of the reasons. Another reason I'm not too concerned is that I think the U.S. now, with a lot of green technologies, we are sort of regaining some mineral independence from China, in the sense that the U.S. actually has, for example, if you think of lithium, right, which is very important for making lithium batteries. The U.S. has lithium. It's just that it has been environmentally harmful to extract that. But now there are new technologies that try to extract lithium in a way that doesn't harm the economy, the environment that much.
Right.
And so then the upside for China to actually take that resource, I think, is going way down now.
So with the Biden administration's decision recently to withdraw from Afghanistan, and also, of course, a new administration means new policies, what, in regards to China, are we seeing in terms of new policies, carried over ideas? Because Biden did promise a clean break from Trump in a lot of regards, but the conventional thinking on China is no longer what it was 20 years ago. So what, in terms of policy, are we seeing this new administration carry over from Trump? Is there anything new that they're bringing to the table in regards to their approach?
So on China policy, I don't see that many differences between the current administration versus the Trump administration. I mentioned the tariffs that are still here. That's the major feature, right? The new boss is the same as the old boss, and the old boss is the one who started the tariffs that are not still not lifted. But sanctions, I think, sanctioning Chinese companies, including the military companies with military ties that you mentioned, Matt, are still there as well. So I think a lot of China policies are still there, which means that we are still closer to the extreme of decoupling. And so because former President Trump sort of made that turn from the romantic engagement I mentioned to the closer to divorce, right? So we are still lingering there, which I don't think is the optimal for the U.S. Economy. What I think the U.S. should come back to is to actually to gather more information about exactly how engagement with China has damaged or compromised our values, our economic system, for example, including the integrity of our stock markets, where a lot of Chinese companies are listed without good quality of disclosure, right? So these are the areas where I think by engaging with China, we have been compromising our values and institutions for 20 years now, And those are the places where we need to fix. I don't see any values in terms of having tariffs on, for example, toys made by China. I don't see how that is advancing our national security. Right.
I don't think taxing Elmo is going to exactly help
exactly.
prevent anything. Yeah.
Exactly. Elmo would say no too.
Right. So with that in mind, then, before we go, are there any last suggestions or ideas for the United States foreign policy going forward? For our listeners listening right now, is there any other changes to our foreign policy you'd suggest in the coming months and years ahead to help deal with this emerging challenge for the United States and for the world?
Right. So I think the pullout from Afghanistan, as chaotic as it has been, is casting doubt on the U.S. commitment to overseas. And I think Taiwan is on top of many people's minds, because if there's any doubt of the U.S. defending interests overseas and working with the allies, Taiwan should be or will be in the forefront between the U.S.-China tensions. And we talked about it in the task force meeting too, when we had the conference. And I think this is a good time now for the U.S. policymakers to demonstrate our commitment to allies. There are many ways to do that, by the way. Not necessarily to say that we'll defend Taiwan if China invades, which I would think is a good promise to make. But besides that, I think there are other ways to show commitments too. For example, forming a trade agreement between U.S. and Taiwan. That will show not only it has economic benefits, but it sends a strong message to China that we are still working with our allies or defending our allies like we used to. So I think that's a very good way to show commitment as well. And I think now is really at the critical time for U.S. policymakers, because we have had this very unpleasant episode in Afghanistan. Yeah. Now is to reaffirm our commitments to show the world that where our powers are and where our commitments are.
A new day brings new opportunities, definitely. Anything else, Karla?
Well, I wanted to thank you for bringing up Taiwan. That came up during the policy hour, and how it looks like we might not be good, might not honor our commitments to other nations. So thank you for bringing that up. And roughly 200 ALEC members signed a letter calling for the administration to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan.
Right. So I think it has been too long, and now is a good time.
It's about time.
I agree.
Absolutely. Well, Karla, Weifeng, thank you for joining us today on ALECtv. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Weifeng.
Thank you, ma'am.
Privilege is all ours, excuse me. Thank you to our viewers here at ALECtv for tuning in. Be sure to stay tuned for more here on our YouTube channel.